In the small town of Millbrook, everyone knew that respect was earned, not given. But when a decorated war general met a humble waitress on the worst day of her life, neither could have predicted that a single moment of cruelty would unleash a storm that would shake the very foundations of power and privilege. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Millbrook as Sarah Martinez hurried towards Danny's diner, her worn sneakers slapping against the cracked pavement. She was already 15 minutes late for her shift, and her boss, Danny, had made it clear that one more tardiness would mean looking for a new job. Sarah couldn't afford to lose this job, not when her mother's medical bills were piling up like autumn leaves in their tiny apartment. At 23, Sarah had already lived through more hardships than most people twice her age. Her father had died in a factory accident when she was 16, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a wife whose heart condition required expensive medication. Sarah had dropped out of college to work full-time, taking on any job she could find to keep their heads above water. The diner job was her third this month, and she desperately needed it to work out. As she pushed through the glass door of Danny's diner, the familiar smell of bacon grease and coffee hit her nostrils. The morning rush was already in full swing, with construction workers grabbing quick breakfasts before heading to their job sites and office workers picking up coffee on their way to work. "You're late again, Sarah," Danny called out from behind the counter, his thick Brooklyn accent cutting through the chatter of customers. Danny Kowalski was a gruff man in his 60s who had run the diner for over 30 years. He had a good heart, but running a struggling business had made him strict about punctuality. "I'm sorry, Danny. My mum had another episode this morning, and I had to wait for the neighbor to come over," Sarah explained, as she tied her apron around her waist. Mrs. Chen from next door often helped watch her mother during Sarah's work hours, but sometimes her own schedule ran late. Danny's expression softened slightly. He knew about Sarah's situation and admired her dedication to her mother. "Just get out there and take care of table 6. They've been waiting for 10 minutes. Sarah grabbed her notepad and pen, quickly checking her reflection in the stainless steel surface of the coffee machine. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her uniform was clean despite being second-hand. She took a deep breath and walked over to table 6. Sitting at the corner table was a man who immediately commanded attention, even in the humble setting of the diner. General Richard Blackstone was an imposing figure in his mid-50s, with steel-grey hair perfectly styled and a posture that spoke of decades of military discipline. His uniform was pristine, decorated with numerous medals and ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career in the army. He was in town for a ceremony honoring local veterans, and word had spread quickly through Millbrook about the famous war hero's visit. General Blackstone had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had received the Medal of Honor for his actions during a particularly brutal battle in Kandahar. The newspapers had written extensively about his heroism, describing how he had led his men through enemy fire to rescue a group of wounded soldiers. His reputation as a brilliant tactician and fearless leader had earned him respect throughout the military and beyond. However, what the newspapers didn't write about was the general's growing arrogance and sense of entitlement. Years of being treated as a hero had inflated his ego, and he had developed a habit of looking down on those he considered beneath his station. Civilians, especially those in service jobs, were often targets of his condescending attitude. "Good morning, sir. I apologize for the wait. What can I get started for you today?" Sarah asked politely, her pen poised over her notepad. The general looked up at her with cold blue eyes, taking in her appearance with obvious disdain. He noticed the small stain on her apron from where she had quickly wiped her hands, the slightly frayed edges of her uniform, and the tired look around her eyes that spoke of too many late nights and early mornings. "I'll have 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, crispy bacon, and coffee." "Black," he said curtly, not bothering to say please or make eye contact. "Absolutely, sir. Would you like hash browns with that?" "Did I ask for hash browns?" the general snapped, his voice carrying across the diner and causing several other customers to look over. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "No, sir. I was just offering I don't need offerings from someone who can't even show up to work on time. I heard your boss reprimanding you when you walked in. If you can't handle the simple task of arriving punctually, how can I trust you to handle my order correctly?" The diner had gone quiet, with even the sizzling sounds from the kitchen seeming to fade into the background. Other customers were now openly staring at the scene unfolding at table 6. Sarah could feel tears threatening to well up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but never someone who seemed to take such pleasure in humiliating her. "I understand, sir. I'll make sure your order is prepared exactly as you specified," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside. As she turned to walk away, she heard the general mutter loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "These people have no pride, no discipline." It's no wonder this country is falling apart when we have workers like this representing our businesses. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She thought about her mother lying in bed at home, struggling to breathe because they couldn't afford the best medication. She thought about working 3 jobs just to pay for basic necessities while this man sat in his expensive uniform, judging her for being 15 minutes late to a job that paid minimum wage. But she also thought about her mother's teachings about dignity and respect, about how treating others with kindness was more important than wealth or status. Sarah took a deep breath and continued walking to the kitchen, determined not to let this man's cruelty break her spirit. "Order for table 6, she called out to Miguel, the cook. Miguel had been working at the diner for 15 years and had seen his share of difficult customers. He had overheard the exchange and gave Sarah a sympathetic look. "Don't let him get to you, mija. Some people think their fancy clothes make them better than everyone else," Miguel said quietly as he cracked eggs onto the grill. While waiting for the order, Sarah busied herself with other tables, forcing a smile for customers who were much kinder than the general. There was old Mr. Gould Peterson, who came in every morning for coffee and always left a $1 tip, even though he lived on a fixed income. There was Maria Santos, a single mother who worked the night shift at the hospital and always thanked Sarah warmly for her service. These were the people who kept Sarah going, who reminded her that most folks were decent and hardworking, just trying to make their way in the world like she was. But the general's words still stung, echoing in her mind as she refilled coffee cups and cleared tables. When Miguel rang the bell indicating the general's order was ready, Sarah straightened her shoulders and picked up the plate. She had decided to kill him with kindness, to show him that his cruel words hadn't broken her spirit. Maybe, just maybe, she could change his perspective about people like her. She approached table 6 with the steaming plate, the eggs cooked perfectly over easy, the bacon crispy just as he had requested, and the wheat toast golden brown.
"Here you are, sir."
2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, crispy bacon, and I'll refresh your coffee right now. The general glanced at the plate with the eye of someone looking for fault. He cut into one of the eggs, and the yolk ran perfectly across the plate. He took a bite of bacon and found it exactly as he had ordered. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe his attitude would soften. Instead, the general looked up at her with the same cold expression. "The toast is too dark." Sarah looked at the toast, which was perfectly golden brown, exactly as most customers preferred it. "I can ask Miguel to make you a new piece if you'd like, sir."
"You should have gotten it right the first time."
This is exactly what I'm talking about. Lack of attention to detail, lack of pride in your work. In the military, we don't accept mediocrity. Sarah felt something snap inside her. She had tried to be professional, had tried to show kindness in the face of his cruelty, but this man seemed determined to humiliate her no matter what she did. Her voice was quiet but firm when she spoke. "Sir, with all due respect, I take great pride in my work. I work hard every day to provide for my family and to serve customers to the best of my ability. I may not have your education or your position, but I have dignity, and I deserve to be treated with basic human respect." The general's face darkened with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he considered so far beneath him. His voice rose to a level that ensured everyone in the diner could hear him clearly. "Dignity? You want to talk about dignity? You show up late to work, you serve substandard food, and now you have the audacity to lecture me about respect. You're nothing but a small-town waitress who will never amount to anything more than serving coffee and wiping tables." Sarah stood frozen as his words hit her like physical blows. Around the diner, she could see other customers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked angry at the general's behavior. Others seemed embarrassed to witness such a scene. Danny had emerged from behind the counter, his face red with indignation at seeing one of his employees treated so poorly. But the general wasn't finished. Standing up from his chair to his full height of 6'2", he towered over Sarah's 5'4" frame. His voice continued to carry across the silent diner. "People like you are what's wrong with America today. No ambition, no discipline, no respect for authority. You expect handouts and sympathy instead of working to better yourselves. I've spent my life serving this country, protecting people like you. And this is the thanks I get. Substandard service from someone who can't even show up on time." Sarah's hands were shaking now, not from fear but from a combination of anger and humiliation. She thought about all the nights she had stayed up caring for her mother, all the times she had chosen between buying groceries and paying bills, all the dreams she had given up to take care of her family. This man knew nothing about her life, her struggles, or her sacrifices, Yet he felt entitled to judge her worth as a human being. "You don't know anything about me or my life," Sarah said, her voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the silent diner. "I know everything I need to know just by looking at you," the general replied with a sneer. "You're a perfect example of the entitled generation that expects everything handed to them." What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. The general, perhaps thinking he was making some kind of point about discipline and respect, picked up his full glass of ice water and threw it directly at Sarah. The cold water hit her square in the chest, soaking through her uniform and dripping onto the floor. Ice cubes scattered around her feet, and the empty glass clattered onto the table. Sarah stood there, dripping wet and humiliated, as the general smirked with satisfaction. "Maybe that will cool down your attitude and remind you of your place," he said loudly. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the diner was completely silent. Even the sounds from the kitchen had stopped as Miguel and the other workers stared in shock at what had just happened. Sarah stood there, water dripping from her hair and clothes, her uniform clinging uncomfortably to her skin. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside Sarah Martinez. All her life she had been taught to be polite, to be respectful, to turn the other cheek. She had endured poverty, loss, and countless small humiliations with grace and dignity. But this man had crossed a line that should never be crossed. He had treated her not just with disrespect, but with active cruelty, and he had done it in front of an entire room full of people. Sarah looked around the diner and saw the faces of her neighbors and regular customers. She saw Mr. Vestry, Peterson shaking his head in disgust at the general's behavior. She saw Maria Santos with tears in her eyes, clearly moved by the injustice of what she had witnessed. She saw Danny moving toward them with an expression of protective anger. But most importantly, she saw herself reflected in the stainless steel surface of the coffee machine behind the general. She saw a young woman who had been pushed too far, who had endured too much, who deserved better than to be treated like garbage by someone who thought his medals made him superior to other human beings. The general was still smirking, clearly pleased with himself for what he saw as teaching her a lesson. He had no idea that he had just awakened something in Sarah that had been dormant for too long, a fierce sense of her own worth and a refusal to accept treatment that no human being should endure. Sarah wiped the water from her face with her sleeve, her eyes never leaving the general's face. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady, but there was something in her tone that made everyone in the diner lean forward to listen. "General Blackstone," she said, using his name for the first time. "You may have medals on your chest and a fancy uniform, but you have just shown everyone in this room exactly what kind of man you really are." The general's smirk faltered slightly. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone he had just publicly humiliated. But Sarah wasn't finished. "You think your service gives you the right to treat other people like garbage, but real honor isn't about what you wear or what titles you hold. It's about how you treat people when you think no one important is watching." Around the diner, customers were nodding in agreement. The general's face was beginning to turn red, but whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. Sarah took a step closer to the general, water still dripping from her uniform. "I work 3 jobs to take care of my sick mother. I've never taken a handout in my life, and I've never asked for anything except the basic respect that every human being deserves. You don't know me, my story, or my struggles. But you felt entitled to judge me and humiliate me because you think your position makes you better than me." The general's mouth opened as if to respond, but Sarah held up her hand. "I'm not finished," she said firmly. "You want to talk about what's wrong with America? It's not people like me, working multiple jobs just to survive. It's people like you, who think their achievements give them the right to look down on everyone else, who forget that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." By now, the entire diner was captivated by Sarah's words. Even the sounds from the kitchen had stopped completely as everyone focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. The general, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, tried to reassert his dominance. "You have no idea who you're talking to, young lady. I've served this country with distinction. And I respect your service," Sarah interrupted. "But your service doesn't give you the right to abuse innocent people. It should have taught you better." The general's face was now fully red with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in public, and certainly not by someone he considered so far beneath his station. His military training had taught him to project authority and command respect, but he had never learned how to handle someone who refused to be intimidated. "You need to learn your place," he said through gritted teeth, taking a step towards Sarah. But Sarah didn't back down. Instead, she stood her ground, her chin raised with dignity despite the water still dripping from her hair. My place is as a human being with value and worth, just like everyone else in this room. Your place is as someone who should know better than to treat others with cruelty. The confrontation had reached a critical moment. Everyone in the diner could feel the tension building, like the air before a thunderstorm. The general was clearly struggling with his anger and his wounded pride, while Sarah stood her ground with a quiet strength that surprised everyone, including herself. What happened next would change both of their lives forever and would become the talk of not just Millbrook, but eventually the entire nation. But in that moment, as they faced each other in the small-town diner, neither could have predicted just how far the ripples of this confrontation would spread. The stage was set for a moment that would test everything both of them believed about power, respect, and what it truly means to serve with honor. The tension in Danny's diner had reached a breaking point. General Blackstone stood face to face with Sarah Martinez, both of them breathing heavily as the confrontation escalated beyond anything anyone in the small restaurant had ever witnessed. The general's face was red with anger and humiliation at being challenged so publicly by someone he considered beneath his notice. "I've had enough of your insubordination," the general snarled, raising his hand as if to strike Sarah. The gesture was meant to intimidate, to remind her of his physical advantage and military training. In his mind, he was dealing with an unruly subordinate who needed to be put back in her place. But Sarah Martinez was no longer the timid waitress who had walked into the diner that morning. Something had awakened in her when the ice water hit her chest, something that had been building through years of struggle, loss, and quiet dignity in the face of hardship. She wasn't going to back down, not anymore. As the general's hand came toward her, Sarah's reflexes kicked in. Her younger brother, Carlos, had taught her basic self-defense moves when she was in high school, worried about her safety as she walked home late from her part-time jobs. Carlos had served a brief stint in the military himself before a medical discharge, and he had drilled into her the importance of being able to protect herself. "If someone bigger than you tries to hurt you," Carlos had told her years ago, "don't try to match their strength. Use their size against them." In one fluid motion, Sarah ducked under the general's raised hand, grabbed his wrist, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling backward. The general, caught completely off guard, lost his balance and crashed into the table behind him. Plates and silverware scattered across the floor with a tremendous clatter that echoed through the silent diner. But that wasn't the end of it. As the general tried to regain his footing, his face twisted with rage at being manhandled by a woman half his size. Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her realize this wasn't over. He was going to come at her again, and next time he might not stop with just intimidation. The general pushed himself away from the table, his uniform now disheveled and his carefully styled hair messed up. "You just assaulted a military officer," he said through gritted teeth, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I defended myself against someone who was about to hit me," Sarah replied steadily. Around the diner, several customers were nodding in agreement. They had all seen the general raise his hand first. The general lunged towards Sarah again, this time with clear intent to physically overpower her. But Sarah was ready. As he reached for her, she stepped to the side and delivered a sharp elbow to his solar plexus, exactly as Carlos had taught her. The general doubled over, gasping for breath, and Sarah followed up with an uppercut that connected squarely with his jaw. The sound of the punch landing was like a gunshot in the quiet diner. General Richard Blackstone, decorated war hero and recipient of the Medal of Honor, dropped to the floor unconscious, knocked out cold by a 23-year-old waitress who had been working double shifts to pay her mother's medical bills. For several seconds, nobody moved. Everyone in the diner stared in shock at the scene before them. The mighty general lay sprawled on the floor among the scattered plates and silverware, while Sarah stood over him, her chest heaving from adrenaline and emotion. Then the silence was broken by slow, deliberate clapping. Old Mr. Peterson, the elderly man who came in every morning for coffee, was applauding from his table near the window. "About time someone knocked that bully down to size," he said loudly. One by one, other customers joined in the applause. Maria Santos was on her feet cheering. Even some of the construction workers who had been quietly eating their breakfasts were clapping and whistling their approval. Danny rushed out from behind the counter, his face a mixture of concern and admiration. "Sarah, are you okay? Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine, Danny," Sarah said, though her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline rush. She looked down at the unconscious general and felt a moment of concern. "Should we call an ambulance?" Miguel emerged from the kitchen, having witnessed the entire confrontation. "He's breathing fine. Just got his bell rung good." Probably the first time in years anyone stood up to him. As they discussed what to do next, the general began to stir. He groaned and slowly opened his eyes, looking confused and disoriented. When his vision focused and he saw Sarah standing over him, the events of the last few minutes came flooding back. What happened? He mumbled, struggling to sit up. You attacked a young woman and she defended herself, Danny said firmly. And now I think it's time for you to leave my establishment. The general struggled to his feet, his legs still unsteady. His uniform was wrinkled and stained. His hair was disheveled, and there was a red mark on his jaw where Sarah's punch had connected. He looked around the diner and saw dozens of eyes staring at him with expressions ranging from disgust to amusement. This is assault, he said weakly, pointing at Sarah. I'll have her arrested. Really? Said a voice from near the door. Everyone turned to see Officer Jim Martinez, one of the local policemen who had just come in for his morning coffee. Jim was no relation to Sarah despite sharing a last name, but he had known her for years and respected her character. I was standing right there in the doorway when it all happened, Officer Martinez continued. I saw you throw water at this young lady. I heard you verbally abuse her, and I saw you raise your hand to her first. If anyone's getting arrested today, it's not going to be her. The general's face went pale as he realized that his actions had been witnessed by a law enforcement officer. His military training had taught him about the importance of discipline and proper conduct, but his arrogance had made him forget those lessons when it mattered most. There's been a misunderstanding, the general said, trying to regain some dignity. I was just trying to teach her about proper respect and discipline. By throwing water at her and trying to hit her? Officer Martinez shook his head. General, I've heard about your service record, and I respect what you've done for this country. But what I just witnessed has nothing to do with honor or discipline. That was bullying, pure and simple. Sarah spoke up, her voice calm despite everything that had just happened. I don't want to press charges. I just want him to leave and never come back. The general looked at Sarah with surprise. After everything he had done to her, she was showing him mercy. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. There might have been shame, but his pride quickly covered it back up. This isn't over, he muttered as he straightened his uniform and headed toward the door. Yes, it is, Sarah said firmly. It's over because I'm not going to let people like you make me feel small anymore, and I think everyone else in this room feels the same way. The general paused at the door, looking back at the room full of people who were all staring at him with expressions of disapproval. These were the people he had sworn to protect and serve. But he had treated them with contempt and cruelty. For the first time in years, he was forced to see himself through their eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. Without another word, General Blackstone pushed through the door and walked out into the morning sunlight. Through the window, the customers watched him get into his black military sedan and drive away, leaving only the lingering memory of his humiliation behind. As soon as he was gone, the diner erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah found herself surrounded by customers offering their support and congratulations. Mr. Peterson pressed a $20 bill into her hand. For standing up to that bully, he said with a wink. Maria Santos gave her a tight hug. You were amazing, honey. That man needed to be taught a lesson, and you were the one brave enough to do it. Danny put his arm around Sarah's shoulders. I'm proud of you, kid. You showed real courage today. And don't worry about your job. After what I saw here, you've got a place at this diner for as long as you want it. But even as Sarah accepted the congratulations and support from the other customers, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. She had just knocked out a decorated military general in front of dozens of witnesses. Word of this incident would spread beyond the diner, beyond Millbrook, and she had no idea what kind of consequences might follow. Officer Martinez approached her as the crowd began to thin out. Sarah, I meant what I said about not pressing charges. What you did was self-defense, plain and simple. But you should know that this is going to get out. A story like this, it's going to spread fast. Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. I know. I'm not sorry for what I did, but I know there might be consequences. There might be, the officer agreed. But there also might be. Sometimes when people stand up for what's right, others take notice. Good people who want to help. As Sarah cleaned up the mess from the confrontation, she reflected on what had just happened. 6 months ago, if someone had told her she would punch out a general in the middle of a diner, she would have laughed at the impossibility of it. She had always seen herself as someone who avoided conflict, who tried to keep her head down and work hard without making waves. But today had shown her something different about herself. When pushed beyond her limits, when faced with genuine injustice and cruelty, she had found reserves of strength and courage she didn't know she possessed. She had stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small by someone in a position of power. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of activity. Word of the incident had already begun to spread through Millbrook's tight-knit community, and people kept coming into the diner just to see the place where it had happened and to congratulate Sarah. Some brought flowers, others brought small gifts, and many simply wanted to shake her hand and tell her they were proud of her. By the time Sarah's shift ended that afternoon, she was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. She had stood up for herself in a way she never had before, and the support from her community had been overwhelming. As she walked home to check on her mother, she felt like something fundamental had changed inside her. Her mother, Elena Martinez, was sitting up in bed when Sarah arrived home, looking more alert than she had in weeks. Mrs. Chen from next door was sitting beside the bed, and both women looked excited about something. "Mija," her mother said, reaching out to take Sarah's hand. "Mrs. Chen told me what happened at the diner today. The whole neighborhood is talking about it." Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed, suddenly feeling the weight of the day's events. "I hope I didn't do something stupid, Mama. I just couldn't let him treat me that way anymore." Elena Martinez had raised her daughter to be strong and proud, to never accept treatment that diminished her dignity as a human being. Even in her illness, her eyes were bright with fierce pride. "You did exactly what I would have done at your age." That man needed to learn that respect goes both ways. But what if there are consequences? What if he tries to cause trouble for us? Her mother squeezed her hand firmly. "Then we'll face whatever comes together just like we always have. But Sarah, sometimes when you stand up for what's right, good things happen too. Sometimes the right people notice." Chen nodded enthusiastically. "She's right, dear. I've lived in this town for 40 years, and I've never seen the community come together like they did for you today. People are proud of you." As the evening wore on, Sarah began to understand what Mrs. Chen meant. Neighbors kept stopping by to check on her and offer their support. The local newspaper called asking for an interview. Someone had even started a social media page called Sarah's Army that was gaining followers by the hour. But perhaps most surprisingly, she received a phone call from an unexpected source. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, but warm. "Miss Martinez, this is Colonel Jennifer Hayes from the Army's Public Affairs Office. I wanted to speak with you about the incident that occurred today." Sarah's heart sank. This was what she had been afraid of, official retaliation from the military. "Yes, ma'am?" "Miss Martinez, I want you to know that General Blackstone's behavior today does not represent the values or standards of the United States Army. We've received multiple reports about the incident, and I want to assure you that appropriate action will be taken." Sarah was stunned. I wasn't expecting that. The Army takes incidents like this very seriously. We also take seriously the character and courage you displayed today. Standing up to someone who was abusing their position of authority takes real strength. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her small living room trying to process everything that had happened. In the span of one day, she had gone from being a struggling waitress, just trying to make ends meet, to being the center of a story that was spreading far beyond her small town. But more importantly, she had discovered something about herself that would change her life forever. She had learned that she was capable of standing up for what was right even when it was scary, even when it was dangerous. She had learned that her voice mattered, that her dignity was worth fighting for, and that sometimes one person's courage could inspire others to find their own. As she looked out the window at the lights of Millbrook, Sarah realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. The story was far from over, and she had no idea where it would lead. But for the first time in years, she felt ready for whatever came next. 3 weeks after the incident at Danny's Diner, Sarah Martinez's life had been completely transformed. What started as a single moment of standing up to a bully had snowballed into something she never could have imagined. Her story had gone viral on social media, been featured on national news programs, and sparked conversations about dignity, respect, and the treatment of service workers across the country. Sarah woke up on this particular Monday morning to find 17 interview requests in her email, including one from a major television network that wanted to fly her to New York City for a primetime special. The small apartment she shared with her mother had become a gathering point for reporters, supporters, and curiosity seekers from around the country. But perhaps more importantly, the attention had brought unexpected opportunities. A crowdfunding campaign started by strangers had raised over $50,000 to help with her mother's medical expenses. 3 different colleges had offered her full scholarships to complete her education. A publisher wanted her to write a book about her experience, and a Hollywood producer had called about the movie rights to her story. It was overwhelming, exciting, and sometimes frightening all at once. "Mija, there's someone at the door for you," her mother called from the living room. Elena Martinez was having one of her good days, her breathing easier thanks to the new medication they could finally afford because of the donations that had poured in. Sarah opened the door to find Colonel Jennifer Hayes, the Army Public Affairs officer who had called her that first evening. The colonel was a tall, dignified woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Miss Martinez, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I have some news I thought you'd want to hear in person." Sarah invited the colonel in and introduced her to her mother. Elena Martinez, despite her illness, insisted on making coffee for their guest, displaying the hospitality that had shaped Sarah's character from childhood. "What I'm about to tell you is not yet public," Colonel Hayes began, "but General Blackstone has been relieved of his command and is facing a formal investigation for conduct unbecoming an officer. The incident at the diner was apparently not an isolated event. Several other complaints have come forward since the story broke." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. She had never wanted to destroy the man's career, despite what he had done to her. What will happen to him? That's not for me to say, but I can tell you that the Army takes these matters seriously. His behavior violated everything we stand for. The colonel paused, studying Sarah's face. "But I'm not here just to update you on his situation. I'm here with an offer." Sarah raised her eyebrows, curious. "The Army would like to offer you a position as a civilian consultant on our new initiative focusing on leadership, respect, and community engagement. Your story has resonated with people across the country, and we believe your voice could help us do better." It was an offer Sarah had never expected. The idea of working with the military, helping to train leaders and promote the values of respect and dignity that had been so lacking in her encounter with General Blackstone, was both appealing and intimidating. "I appreciate the offer, Colonel, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that."
Colonel Hayes smiled.
"Miss Martinez, you showed more leadership in 5 minutes in that diner than some officers display in their entire careers. Leadership isn't about rank or education. It's about character, courage, and the ability to stand up for what's right. You've demonstrated all of those qualities." As they discussed the details of the potential position, Sarah's mind wandered to all the changes in her life over the past few weeks. The attention had been incredible, but it had also been challenging. She had received thousands of supportive messages, but also some vicious criticism from people who thought she had overreacted or who believed she was seeking attention. The most difficult part had been dealing with the attempts to discredit her story. Some people online had tried to dig up dirt on her family, criticizing her father's work history, her mother's immigration status, and Sarah's own past. It had been painful to see her family's private struggles exposed and twisted to fit certain narratives. But for every cruel comment, there had been dozens of messages of support. Teachers had written to tell her about using her story to discuss bullying and standing up for yourself. Parents had shared how her example had inspired their children to speak up against unfairness. Service workers from around the country had reached out to thank her for giving them a voice. After Colonel Hayes left, Sarah sat with her mother in their small living room, looking through some of the letters that had arrived that day. There was one from a teenage girl in Ohio who had been bullied at school and found the courage to report it after hearing Sarah's story. Another came from an elderly man in California who had been mistreated by his home health aide and finally spoke up after being inspired by Sarah's example. "You know what makes me proudest," her mother said, holding one of the letters. "It's not the money or the job offers or the television interviews. It's this, knowing that your courage gave other people courage too." Sarah nodded, understanding what her mother meant. The material benefits had been life-changing for their family, but the real impact was in the conversations that were happening across the country about how people deserve to be treated. That afternoon, Sarah returned to work at Danny's Diner. Despite all the opportunities that had come her way, she had decided to keep working there while she figured out her next steps. The diner had become something of a tourist attraction, with people driving hours just to eat at the place where the famous confrontation had occurred. Danny had embraced the attention, putting up a small plaque at table 6 that read, "Sarah Martinez stood here," and adding "the General's comeuppance" to the menu as a special sandwich. He had also given Sarah a significant raise and made her assistant manager. As Sarah worked her shift that afternoon, she reflected on how much had changed, not just in her circumstances, but in how she saw herself. 3 weeks ago, she had been a young woman who tried to avoid conflict, who absorbed disrespect without fighting back, who believed that keeping her head down was the best way to survive. Now she understood that sometimes conflict was necessary, that standing up for yourself and others was not selfish but essential, and that her voice had value and power. She had learned that dignity was not something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something she possessed inherently and had the right to defend. Around 3 p.m., a familiar black sedan pulled up outside the diner. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the vehicle. Through the window, she saw General Blackstone sitting in the passenger seat, but he made no move to get out. Instead, a younger officer emerged from the driver's side and walked toward the diner entrance. The young lieutenant looked nervous as he approached Sarah. "Miss Martinez? I'm Lieutenant David Walsh. General Blackstone would like to speak with you if you're willing."